I'm Charles Shapiro, the President of the World Affairs Council, and I want to welcome you all. Our program today is with Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, who are the co-authors of The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. I woke up this morning listening to Peter Baker on The Daily, the New York Times daily podcast, and here he is live. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent of the New York Times, and I think I need to note that he is not related to James A. Baker III. Susan Glasser writes the column Letters from Trump's Washington in the New Yorker, where she's a staff writer. She was founding editor of POLITICO magazine and editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. Before that, a longtime reporter and editor with the Washington Post. Their marriage has survived, writing 2 books together. I want to ask everybody in the audience, as you are logging on, please send your questions to me using the Q&A function on the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Make the questions short, end them in a question mark, and please use your name. I'm not going to ask anonymous questions. So, welcome. And I guess you guys have done this many times, and so you know who's going to answer the question. I found out last night, I had a meeting with a bunch of our members who are 35 and under, that none of them had any idea who Jim Baker is. So in the book you quote Henry Kissinger as asking, who the hell is James A. Baker? I'm going to ask you that question. Who is James A. Baker?
Well, that's a great question. And Charles, thank you very much for doing this. And thank everybody for tuning in. James Baker was, for his time, the indispensable man in Washington. He really, in some ways, was, as Tom Donilon, who was Barack Obama's national security advisor, put it, probably the most important unelected official in Washington in the post-World War II generation. In other words, in the last 50 years or so. He ran 5 presidential campaigns. He was Reagan's chief of staff and Treasury secretary. He was George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State and White House chief of staff. And in many ways had his hand involved in almost every major thing that happened in this country between the end of the Watergate and the end of the Cold War.
And this is the first book that anybody's written on Baker?
Yeah, the first comprehensive book. I mean, you could write a book alone just on that incredible period that was the end of the Cold War, which coincided with the first President Bush's presidency. But in reality, you know, it's actually a much bigger frame story about, you know, the transformation of American politics as well as international politics. And I think that was a little bit the surprise for Peter and I. You know, what's interesting is that this book it's a study in power in Washington and how it worked at a particular moment in time. And, you know, I think that that's what's interesting for a new generation that's grown up only in the context of incredible Washington dysfunction and gridlock, and a sense, you know, that the 2 parties don't work anymore. They don't even speak to each other, literally, actually, right? In the case of our Speaker of the House, who hasn't spoken with the President of the United States for a year. But at the same time, you know, it's certainly not an exercise in nostalgia, right? It's an exercise in understanding how the roots of this modern dysfunction, where do they come from? And Baker, as a builder and shaper of the modern Republican Party, I think, is a fascinating character in that respect as well.
But he was remarkably ideology-free, it seemed.
Yeah, he was, look, he's a conservative and he's from Texas. And he definitely has, you know, the basic values of a conservative Republican, but he wasn't tied to ideology. Ideology didn't govern him. He wanted to get things done, right? He would say that all the time, was Reagan's chief of staff, that Reagan wanted him to be a pragmatist because he would say, I'd rather get 80% of what I want rather than fly my flag, you know, running over the cliff. There's no point in standing on principle and not getting anything done, which is so anathema, I think, to today's Washington. And that's why I think that Baker's story is so interesting to anybody sort of trying to understand today's politics, see where we came from.
Okay, so speaking of today's Washington, you've got you both start and end the book talking about Trump. I mean, they're the bookends. Why is that? I mean, why did you feel it necessary? Is that just to sell books and to make it up to date, or is?
Look, you know, Trump is the elephant in the room, literally. In this case, if you want to talk about the rise of the Republican Party, you can't avoid talking about where it's ended up. And I think that, it was an interesting sort of fact about this book that we started it 7 years ago in the sort of now dim recesses of the Obama era in 2013, when already it was clear that, things in Washington didn't work anymore, and a sense of sort of paralysis and gridlock and, dysfunction at the core of our politics. That made Peter and I very interested in going back and examining a different and frankly much more optimistic moment in the world, as well as in Washington, where we spent most of our careers. But of course, the rise of Trump really came, I think, to dominate and overshadow the last 5 years. And our conversations with Baker and his own sort of angst and agony over what to do with, this sort of hostile takeover of the Republican Party by someone that he viewed as anathema. Whose core principles were very different from Jim Baker's, as well as from the Republican Party itself. And yet the party could not disavow it in a way that actually Baker's own struggles sort of foreshadowed and mirrored this. And so we felt that it was an important coda to the story, an important part of the story. And in many ways, actually, I think it helped us to understand our subject. This book is not a celebration of power, and it's not a celebration of Jim Baker. It's a study of both of those things. And, we kept asking Baker the same question over and over again about Donald Trump. How could you, even very reluctantly find yourself voting for someone who you denounce in such strong terms? And in a way, he gave us the same answer over and over again in a way that helped us ultimately to understand him better. When someone tells you who they are, you need to listen.
I mean, the parallels between Reagan and Trump are pretty, I hadn't thought of it quite that way until I read the book. So I want to thank you for that. But that Reagan was the outsider. Reagan was the disruptor. Reagan was the guy who was disrupting the Republican Party.
Right. And that was right. Baker makes this comparison in 2016 when he's first talking about Trump's rise at this lunch at Nancy Reagan's funeral with Brian Mulroney, the former Canadian Prime Minister, Newt Gingrich, and I think though, and he makes the point that both of them were entertainers in effect. But I think that the comparison then kind of ends around there, because for Reagan, for all of his disruption and his outsider quality, ultimately did want to get government to work. And he wasn't about divisiveness for the sake of divisiveness. Now, he could be polarizing, every president is on some level. But I think in the end, there's still a remarkable difference between Reagan and Trump. And I think Baker comes to see that, as you see in the book, and finds it troubling and disturbing.
Look, he was the adult in the room for Ronald Reagan. And, that theory of the case with Donald Trump has just been proven to be wrong and impossible. Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson, who was Jim Baker's friend, they could not guide and shape the Trump presidency in the way that Baker was able to do in the Reagan presidency, largely because the character of the presidents themselves was the main difference. Sure, they were both outsiders, but Ronald Reagan not only is a sunny optimist, to Trump's sort of dark fear-mongering, but he also was somebody who wanted to hire and to rely upon the guidance of first-rate staff, and even was willing to bring in a Jim Baker who had run not one, but two national campaigns against him. Think about that in comparison with a White House where slavish loyalty seems to be the main criterion for being hired and then promoted.
I thought it was interesting is what Baker says is the role of the White House chief of staff. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, exactly. Well, he always reminds people that, the emphasis is on the word staff, not chief, right? And that and that the people who take that job who often get tripped up are the ones who forget that. And Baker became sort of the gold standard of chiefs of staff. Basically, Democrats and Republicans will tell you that they try to model themselves off of him, sometimes more successfully than not. Again, not about ideology, but about how do you manage to make things work? How do you manage to get things done? Baker, he ran the White House understanding how the gears worked. He understood how to get things done. When he first comes up with a power sharing arrangement with Ed Meese, who was Reagan's, real true believer, the keeper of the flame, he understands that the things that matter that he puts in his column on the piece of paper are press, legislative affairs, personnel, and particularly the paperwork, the paper that goes to the Oval Office. He says, I'll just take care of that kind of stuff. And you can do all the policy stuff. And you can have the title of counselor to the president and a cabinet rank. And Baker was perfectly happy to give his rival cabinet rank, which made Ed Meese happy because it sounded good, but it didn't actually mean anything. Baker understood that having cabinet rank in a White House doesn't actually give you any actual power. Controlling the paper to the Oval Office, controlling the press and the legislative shops does.
And what does he say his job is for the president? For what is he supposed to detect?
Yeah, right.
Well, he's the shit detector,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And dealer with once he's detected it.
Right.
It's a grueling job. And interestingly, given that Baker really was the gold standard of doing it, and in a way that, by the way, applies not just to White Houses. I think, you could also kind of study Jim Baker as a leadership guide to how to, thrive and flourish in fiercely competitive dysfunctional institutions. But, in the White House, he's not only the ship detector, but he might have been the best at doing the job. He hated the job, and he was desperate to escape it. And that was one thing I think that, came through as Peter and I went back and, did the research and looked into it. In fact, one of his few screw ups as White House Chief of Staff was in managing his own exit. He had artfully arranged what he thought would be a job swap that would enable him to become Reagan's national security advisor a couple of years into the administration. Forcing one of his enemy, William Clark, was going to be leaving the job, and Baker thought he would slot in and take his ally in the White House, Mike Deaver, and make him chief of staff. But he screwed up in a way that, by the way, is useful for anyone planning a palace coup, whether in their company or their country. He failed to keep the president's body in sight at all times, which orchestrating a coup is something you definitely should do. And they got Reagan to sign off on this job swap. They handed him a piece of paper with a press announcement that he was going to go down to the White House briefing room and read. But they didn't accompany President Reagan to the key meeting in the White House Situation Room, where all of the national security team would be informed of this coup. And those were all, of course, Baker's enemies. And so when Reagan went down there, Clark was able to rally the opposition since Baker wasn't there. Reagan, hornswoggled by this, goes back up to the Oval Office, calls up Baker and Deaver and says, fellas, we got a revolt on our hands. So, that was a rare screw up. But look, it was a grueling, demanding job, especially with a president like Reagan, who didn't sweat the details and left them largely, and also was quite conflict averse, left Jim Baker to deal with the messes.
If Baker was the gold standard as White House Chief of Staff, how was he as Secretary of State? I mean, is he the best Secretary of State since Kissinger, or the best Secretary of, you've got Condi Rice, Madeleine Albright, you tell him, Mike Pompeo. I mean, who is the best Secretary of State since Kissinger?
Well, I'd say Baker was the most consequential Secretary of State. I think that's the way I would judge a Secretary of State. What did they get done? What happened on their watch? What did they achieve? And I think that, frankly, you could even argue about whether Baker or Kissinger, rises to the top in the post-World War II era. For Baker, he is managing the end of the Cold War. He is helping to reunify Germany. He's assembling the coalition that includes, by the way, the Soviet Union and Syria and China, that expels Iraq out of Kuwait and establishes a new kind of world order, right? That's what George Bush called it at the time. He convenes the Arabs and the Israelis together in a peace conference, the very first time Israel sits down with all of its Arab neighbors for what is the beginning, anyway, of what could have been a more meaningful peace process that gets interrupted by the 1992 election. So I think Baker, as a Secretary of State, stands right up there, the most consequential of them anyway.
I have a Baker Secretary of State question. And one is did he commit not to extend NATO to the east? One of the great complaints of Russia is that NATO, that the Baltic states, that Poland have joined NATO, that their armed enemies are aligned against them, and that's why Russia is so hostile to the United States, and that in fact Jim Baker had committed to Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, that his foreign minister, that NATO would not expand to the east.
Right. Well, this is, Vladimir Putin, has sort of been using this argument for quite some time. It's a classic ex post facto explanation. I should be clear, first of all, that NATO expansion actually occurred after George Bush was defeated, after Jim Baker was no longer on the scene. There was a negotiating session in which the reunification of the two Germanys was being negotiated. One of the hottest, most contentious issues was the question of NATO membership for the reunified Germany, and also therefore what would happen to the formerly East German territory, on which of course hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops had been stationed and would be withdrawn as part of this. And so at the time, I think it's very important to remember that the Warsaw Pact still existed, and there was no thought that it was going to break up in such a short period of time, just like there was no thought that the Soviet Union itself was going to cease to exist. So, the framework for that conversation, was utterly different than what the world looked like just a couple years later. And so there was this one negotiating session where Baker did say that there would not be NATO troops on the territory of the former East Germany. Immediately thereafter, back in Washington, Condoleezza Rice, then working on the National Security Council, sounded the alarm. Baker had gotten out in front of the negotiating position, out in front of the talking points. He knew it too, and he never repeated that line again. I think Peter often makes the point, and I think it's a very significant one, that not only was the context totally different from what Putin is now talking about, but in fact, they actually then did come up with a formal agreement with Mikhail Gorbachev and Eduard Shevardnadze, and nowhere was this issue mentioned of no NATO troops anywhere. So, if the Soviets had that as an agreement, believe me, it would have been written down on paper. And in fact, one of the reasons that you hear Vladimir Putin say this quite often is because his line has always had to have been about an unjust peace imposed upon Russia at the end of the Cold War, rather than something that was acquiesced to by the Soviet leadership. And in fact, the key moment was really many months later in Washington, D.C., when Mikhail Gorbachev, with a table full of Soviet generals sitting around him and somewhat aghast at it, made the enormous concession that effectively ended the Cold War. And that was a concession by Gorbachev to the reality, that he was no longer able to maintain the Soviet empire.
Yeah, I would add one thing. Is it Baker himself, having said that, having not made this commitment in the way that Putin frames it, does raise questions about whether or not we should have continued to expand NATO or not. I mean, he does think that that's an issue that is a legitimate one to question. In fact, he has written a piece, I think he wrote it back in the 90s, suggesting, hey, let's make Russia a member of NATO. In other words, rather than make it an anti-Russia thing, let's try to bring bring Russia into our Western structures, which obviously didn't happen. Anyway, the conversation at the time was only about a temporary jurisdiction while there was a transition, to the full Germany. It was never a commitment, as Susan says, to not expand NATO beyond that.
And as writers, I mean, it just struck me how much was written down. I mean, that first of all, it was pre-email. It was at a time when people actually sent each other written notes, and it sounds like Jim Baker must have a gigantic room in his home, with file cabinets and all of that stored away. I mean, is that all that preserved?
He is a pack rat. He has saved almost every piece of paper, I think, that he ever touched in his life. And they're all, he had the archives at Princeton or Rice University, where his family is in Houston. There are some papers he gave us that weren't in either of those archives. We had complete access to all of these papers. And you're right, the papers really help you reconstruct as authors, as biographers. To have paper is the best thing of all, because people's memories are always, flawed or always human. People misremember things or over time, conflate them with things. Paper doesn't lie. And it really helped us. Now, he didn't keep diaries, so we don't have like intimate thoughts.
It's not a record of his inner life. We have some doodles, which is kind of interesting. I mean, there are actually some contemporaneous notes he's passing back and forth in the Reagan cabinet meetings and the like, which I do offer some real-time insights into, he
making fun of Al Haig.
Oh yeah, or Ed Meese, he's calling him the, like the Pillsbury Doughboy. But Baker was not a highly introspective subject, and so I think it was therefore even more valuable to us to have this kind of real-time documentary record, even of his early life and his family. He helpfully explained to us that he and his friends had given his father the nickname of the Warden, which did tell you a lot about the kind of disciplinarian, a tough environment he grew up in, a life of great privilege actually in Houston, but also one of constraints and duty and obligation to this tough father. Just as revealing about his dad were the piles of notes that Jim Baker had saved that were really more akin to like curt memos from his dad when he was well into adulthood, married with children, working at another law firm in Houston. And yet his father would still send him checks for, here's $25 to buy a suit. Here's money for your wife's Christmas present. Here's money even to pay the obstetrician to deliver your sons. And you get a sense of the controlling, even micromanaging nature of this father-son relationship in a way that was really invaluable to see it written down like that.
Let me go to the privilege bit of it. I mean, in the introduction, you say first chapter, you say privilege is his birthright. And that really, I mean, in today's society, I mean, it seemed so shocking almost. I mean, that here is a guy who's the fourth generation of this Houston family, who really, if anybody's born with a silver spoon in his mouth, it's Jim Baker. Prep school, Princeton, does that world exist? How do you square that with what is clearly your admiration for Jim Baker?
Well, look, he is somebody who, interestingly enough, was able, and one of his successes in his career was the ability to transcend his initial environment or to work, across otherwise uncrossable lines, right? He had a sort of shape-shifting ability. One of his legislative aides from later in his career would talk about him and his effectiveness on Capitol Hill, that he could credibly, sit there in his cowboy boots and talk duck hunting with Jesse Helms, the arch conservative senator from North Carolina, then go next door and equally credibly in his monogrammed shirts talk about opera with Chris Dodd, the patrician senator from Connecticut. But when he grew up, you're right to emphasize the insular and extraordinarily privileged background that Jim Baker came from. He himself tells with some mortification the story of his childhood in Depression era Houston. Baker was born basically within months of the Great Depression starting. And, when he would go to school, his mother would send a hot lunch to school every day with the chauffeur. And Baker had to go out to the front gate and pick up this hot lunch from the chauffeur. And he was mortified. He begged his mother, can I have a sandwich like the other boys? No, absolutely not. And it was a constraining world, but one that could have been really detached from reality. And interestingly, Baker spent his first few decades, really up until he was almost 40, not overtly rebelling against this, but living within it. He was a country club man. He spent his weekends, as a good old boy. He was shooting things. Barbara Bush used to joke that, in fact, because hunting season began around Election Day, that's why he never voted until he got into politics. He, at Princeton, he was a terrible student and in fact went wild from finally being outside of the confines of his father. He was apparently drunken for much of his time there. So that makes his later story I think, all the more remarkable, actually.
Let me remind everybody to please send in questions. We're going to take questions. I mean, I've got a ton. I can keep going. We haven't mentioned George Bush yet. I mean, and that friendship between the two of them is the friendship of a lifetime.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And it is at the heart of the story in a lot of ways, right? One of the things we learned, I think, in doing this book, or would reinforce anyway in doing this book, is the accidents of history, right? That things, change on a dime for random reasons. Jim Baker might never have been Secretary of State had it not been for meeting on the tennis courts of the Houston Country Club this young oilman named George Herbert Walker Bush, who just moved to Houston. And the two of them were fiercely competitive, and they became doubles partners. And it was that friendship that was so profound in their partnership, right? If you go back in history, and your members know more about foreign affairs than most everybody, and you can't find a Secretary of State and a president who had the kind of relationship that Bush and Baker had, right? One that was rooted in friendship that preceded politics. A lot of secretaries of state are political allies of a president, or even political rivals of a president, right? Like Hillary Clinton had run against Barack Obama. These guys were friends long before politics. In fact, he only gets into politics because of a tragedy in his early life, in which Jim Baker's first wife comes down with cancer. She's got a terminal diagnosis. And the one person in the world that Jim Baker tells, he doesn't even tell his wife, because he wants her to have the best possible few last months of life possible.
A questionable call, we should say.
Absolutely, but it was 1969. This is a different era and wrong call. But my point is, the one person he tells, the one person he confides his terrible secret in, is George Bush. And the last people outside the family to see Mary Stuart alive in the hospital were the Bushes. This is a bond that's powerful, right? And so they go into politics together. Bush says, deal with your grief by helping me run for Senate. They go through all these big moments. And at the end of life, who is there on George Bush's last day of life? 3 times goes to his house. Jim Baker, the man is standing next to his bed as George Bush is passing away, literally rubbing Bush's feet in their last farewell to each other. So this is a relationship that's so interesting. And that is at the root of this book.
Gail Evans asks, it's interesting to see how many powerful men like Jim Baker have longtime women assistants who wield huge power. Can you talk about Margaret Tutwiler a bit? And first of all, tell us who she is.
Yeah, well, it's a good observation. I mean, one thing about Baker, clearly he was a man of his era. Peter's just told this story about him not telling his wife and telling George Bush about her fatal cancer diagnosis. And by the way, Barbara Bush actually, gave an interview for this book in which she said it was a terrible mistake on Jimmy's part, and I think Jimmy knows it. Which is interesting. But, Baker is a supremely self-confident figure by the time he gets to Washington. And one of the things he was great at doing was promoting talent in a pretty equal opportunity way. He really seemed to want to surround himself with A-plus players, and was pretty indifferent to what their backgrounds were, or, notions about what was proper or not. And Margaret Tutwiler, was a fascinating character, a Birmingham debutante who had a natural flair, it turned out, for politics, and started working with Baker in the 1976 Jerry Ford campaign, and essentially was with him throughout his public life. And she was much more than an assistant, ultimately ended up being, his sort of chief communications advisor, and really something of an alter ego, a Baker whisperer, if you will. And again, no real hints that we picked up of sexism or many biases beyond the overall biases of the era in Baker. I just think that he was a sort of an A player who understood that it made him look good, and that if he wanted to succeed, he needed to be surrounded by A players.
A question from Jacobus Forrest. Baker clearly had great impact in administration. How about his role as a negotiator with Congress?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, and that's one of the reasons we think his story tells us a lot about Washington, both then and now, right? He was a fierce partisan, a real knife fighter when it came to elections. He ran 5 presidential campaigns, I think, as we said. And if you ask Michael Dukakis or Al Gore, they wouldn't tell you that Baker was some sort of a softie. He was, he would gut you if he thought that's what was necessary in order to win. But once he won, they put down the knives and he and his generation, at least his team, his plug-in unit, tried to get stuff done. So he sat down with the Democrats in 1983 and renegotiated how the structure of Social Security. The last time we had a bipartisan deal to really do that in a major way. He sat down in 1986 and cut a deal with the Democrats to rewrite the entire tax code. Again, the last time that's happened on a bipartisan basis. And after George H.W. Bush wins the presidency and he's going to be Secretary of State, after this tough campaign with Michael Dukakis and the Pledge of Allegiance and Willie Horton, Baker, a month later, is sitting down with Jim Wright, the Democratic Speaker of the House, saying, hey, let's figure out how to make this Contra War, which has been so debilitating for the United States for the last decade. Let's figure out how to make that go away. So the difference between then and now is that Baker's politics were ruthless, but it was about getting to a place where you could get stuff done. And today, it seems like the governing is all about how to set yourself up for the next election rather than the other way around.
I think it's fascinating. I'm going back to Tutwiler a little bit, how Baker took his group of people with him wherever he went and just plugged them in, whether it was at Treasury or State Department or wherever, that he had people whose confidence he had. I'm a career State Department guy, and I can remember very well the resentment of the career State Department people, how little access we had to the Secretary of State when he was secretary. But it sure didn't hurt his ability to accomplish stuff. Matter of fact, it probably helped letting us deal with the day-to-day stuff, and he and his team focusing on the really, truly important stuff.
Well, I think that's an important insight. You're absolutely right that he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way in those large professional bureaucracies, both at Treasury and at State. I would say one difference, because we see it right now, there's a disdain for careers, but it's a different kind of disdain, right? You know, Baker didn't see himself as making war on the State Department or that his mission was to abolish or downgrade it. In fact, he was perfectly willing to accept expertise or professional advice, or to let, diplomats handle the crises that didn't rise to his level. He didn't have an ideological bone to pick with the Treasury Department or the State Department. He was very mission focused, and he had built what he called his plug-in unit that consisted not only of Tutwiler, but, really sharp players like Bob Zellick, Dick Darman, especially not at the State Department, but before that, Darman had been his key advisor in the Reagan White House, and then at the Treasury Department, he was probably the best policy entrepreneur of his generation, and someone who understood not only how to have an idea, but how to move the machinery of government to make it happen. And Darman was really a key element in making Jim Baker look good. At the State Department, he had Dennis Ross, who ran his policy planning staff, but was really much more, was a crucial advisor, and I think a key channel between the ideas of the professional Foreign Service and Baker. But Baker wasn't hesitant to ride roughshod over the Foreign Service. For example, German reunification, which in many ways was the pinnacle of Jim Baker's diplomacy, right? I mean, it was an incredible, sort of act of, spinning plates up in the air and managing for them not all to smash down at the same time. When Baker, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which shocks the professional bureaucracy, right. And actually there is a really interesting memo which came out of the European Bureau a few months before the fall of the Berlin Wall, in which it advised Secretary Baker that German unification was a pipe dream. It wasn't going to happen. It was a fantasy. And so it really, came as a shock to the professionals inside the Foreign Service. Baker, after the fall of the wall, wants to be the first American official there on the ground, and actually uses his sharp elbows to make sure Dan Quayle doesn't get the honor. Then he shows up in Berlin, and he says, and he tells, there are two ambassadors at this time, right? There's the U.S. ambassador to West Germany, and there's the U.S. ambassador to East Germany. And he tells them in a meeting, I would like to be the first American Secretary of State to go beyond East Berlin, and I would like to go into East Germany itself on this trip. And the U.S. ambassador to West Germany tells him, no, that's not a good idea. the U.S. ambassador to East Germany says, absolutely, you can shore up the internal forces of reform and revolution, that are still building strength, and we can really give a crucial assist to these brave East Germans if you do it. And Baker is furious with Vernon Walters, the ambassador to West Germany. And he not only disregards him and goes on the trip, he freezes him out completely from all the historic meetings and negotiations over the unification of Germany.
Yeah, but of course, he's the one who had appointed Vernon Walters in the first place. So,
I think Walters was already there. Now, he was an old crony of George Herbert Walker Bush's, and he considered himself to be a friend of Bush. And I think that is why he felt maybe secure enough to defy Jim Baker. But it turned out not to be a good idea to defy Jim Baker.
Not a good idea at all. And I have to note here for the record that we've just celebrated the 30th anniversary of German unification. I mean, something that I will say, I just thought was extraordinary at the time. Really amazing. Question from Edward Chartar. If asked, what would be Jim Baker's advice to the next administration in Washington, particularly on foreign affairs?
Right. Good question. I think his first advice would be restore American leadership in the world and restore alliances. He's very worried that our desire to pull back under Trump and to some extent under Obama before him has left America without the primary seat at the table. He's particularly worried about how we have offended our allies in NATO, particularly thinks that Trump has unnecessarily burned bridges. Baker is a believer in internationalism. He wants America to be part of the conversation, if not the main driver of the conversation. And I think he's found a lot of what Trump has done in the international sphere to be most offensive. Remember, this is the guy who negotiated the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Pact that became the basis for NAFTA. And so when Trump comes along and trashes NAFTA, Baker is like, hey, that was a great deal. What are you talking about? And while Baker may or may not have gone along with all the different treaties and agreements that Trump has decided to trash, he believes in agreements as a general principle, right? He believes in arms control. He believes in the UN. He advised George H.W. Bush to go to the UN to get sanctions, to get approval of the Gulf War in the first place, even though Dick Cheney and others saying you don't have to do it and you shouldn't do it. So he's a believer in that. And I think that he's found these last 4 years to be especially troublesome in that regard.
Yeah, and I guess as a corollary to that, I would say that he really was committed to the notion of American leadership that is defined by diplomacy and working with and through others. And one core belief of his that we found, and again, he's often portrayed as a kind of non-ideological figure, but a core belief of his, is a deep concern about the militarization of American foreign policy over the last few decades. And there are very few, if any, instances in which he is a believer that American military force and might should be used in the world unless our national interests were much more directly threatened. And it's that deep fear of military power combined with an abiding faith in American diplomatic power that's sharply at odds, frankly, with where our national security thinking has been in recent years.
Which is that Republican Party, the globalist, internationalist, pro-free trade, good government Republican Party, is that party, is that a thing of the past? Is that a thing of the 70s, 80s, and 90s?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in some ways it has obviously moved on. He himself says, my party has moved away from me. I don't know that that's necessarily permanent. We'll see what happens. There'll be another Republican president someday, and we'll see whether they, drift back to some of the core tenets of the Republican Party as they existed under Baker and Bush and Reagan in the past, or whether Trump has made a permanent change. I think some of what Trump has done is individual to Trump. He has a very, very specific view of the world as America being a chump in all of this globalization. But I think the backlash that he represents to globalization is real. And that any president, Democrat or Republican, is going to have to deal with that sentiment in America in a way that Baker didn't have to. There was a bipartisan consensus really until the last few years that free trade was good, that internationalism was good, that alliances were good. And that's sort of been frayed, I think, in these last 4 years.
Well, free trade is good, but both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump campaigned against free trade.
Yes, but Hillary Clinton most likely would have found a way to have put TPP, as an example, the Asia trade agreement, into practice with some adjustments. In the same way Bill Clinton took the NAFTA agreement that he inherited from George H.W. Bush, added some labor and environmental side agreements, and then sold it to Congress. My guess is that Hillary Clinton was running for her liberal base by criticizing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but in the end, she still had a fundamental belief in free trade if done in the right way, whatever you consider the right way.
Well, again, we don't know the ending of the story yet. If Biden wins, you will see him, in fact, one of his first agenda items, he said it all along, will not only be to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, but, probably to return to many of the international agreements that, Trump has blown up, which is not just the Paris Climate Agreement, but in fact, things like the Iran nuclear deal, although the question remains about whether that's still available to rejoin. Things like the Open Skies Treaty, arms control with Russia, things like that. And because Trump has sort of arguably overplayed his hand, you have a situation right now where the latest Pew Global Attitude Survey showed that in many of our countries of our key allies, places like Germany and France, and the leaders of China and Russia, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, are actually more respected and more considered to do the right thing in international affairs than the president of the United States. So in a way, that's opened up an opportunity for Biden to return to a kind of internationalism and diplomacy first American foreign policy. So we don't know the end of the story yet, but I think Peter's right that we are witnessing this kind of massive political realignment in the United States and a change in the coalition of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And Baker's is actually the story of the last great realignment in American politics. The Southern strategy that changed people like him from being Southern Democrats, even though they didn't agree with the National Party, into being hardcore Republicans. And now we're at another inflection point. And so we don't know yet how far that shaking out of the two-party coalitions will go.
Beverly Ferguson asked, and this is on a more personal level, both of you have been in Washington for decades, writing, covering administrations, Republican and Democratic. What has shocked you most about Washington politics over your careers?
Most shocking. I think what shocked us, or at least I'll speak for me and Susan can agree or disagree. What shocked me, I think, most in the last few years is how fragile our institutions in some ways really are. That a lot of the norms, at least, maybe not the institutions, but certainly the norms that we thought were kind of rules of the road, in fact, aren't. I covered 3 presidents before this one, and I thought I understood how a White House worked. I thought I understood how a presidency worked. I thought I understood the lanes in which they could travel, what was acceptable, what was not acceptable, what was doable, what was not doable. And suddenly you have a guy come along, and some people say this is a good thing, and it's completely shattered all of those. He couldn't care less what every other president did. And so the things that we thought were kind of hard and fast rules of politics, he's just blown right past. And we'll see whether that's accepted or not accepted in this election. Again, a lot of people think that's a good thing. They sent him to Washington, in their view, to disrupt, to break China, to shatter the old ways of doing things. But I've been surprised at how easily things I thought were hard and fast rules, in fact, are not actually written into law anywhere and are simply expectations and norms that people abided by because they thought that was what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, and I do agree with all of that. And I would just add the sort of corollary to it, watching day in and day out as that process has unfolded of, shattering those norms and seeing, to me, in a way, almost it's the death of a certain kind of American exceptionalism. The idea that America is made of different stuff and that, the uniqueness of our history and our political institutions would essentially insulate us from human nature and character has obviously, been deeply challenged by what we're watching. In some ways, right, the character of our current president is kind of an open book, right? He is, shocking and outrageous, but also quite predictable. You can have a pretty clear read on Trump and what he wants to do and what's driving him. Watching the rest of Washington go along with that has been something really eye-opening for me. And in a way, much more reminiscent. The experience that's often seemed most relevant for me and Peter in the last few years has been our experience in covering the first few years of Vladimir Putin's presidency in Russia, as much as it was, when covering Washington when we first were journalists here in the 1990s. I mean, watching in Russia, we were there for this crucial period when Putin was consolidating power and rolling back the kind of fragile democratic gains of the 1990s. And, we would go, when we first were there, we would, go out to lunch with, say like a think tank person, who was a Democrat in the 1990s. Those people now, 20 years into Vladimir Putin's tenure, are either dead in exile or public cheerleaders for Vladimir Putin. And, America is still different, thank goodness, than Russia. And we do have a different history and a different culture. But, when you watch day in and day out, people who called the president of the United States unfit for office, a menace to society, a kook, a maniac, and then you spend 4 years watching them slavishly praise him. It's really been an extraordinary thing to bear witness to.
Wow. Susan Glasser, Peter Baker, thank you so much for spending time with us. I appreciate it. Let me see if I can hold this so that everybody can read it. This is a fabulous book, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. We put the link to purchasing the book in the chat, so everybody can please link on that. Buy this book. You're going to want to read it. This has been great. I've got a couple of things to announce. If you've enjoyed this, it's time to join the World Affairs Council. If you're not a member, we've got some upcoming programs next week. On October 20th, we have Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr speaking on the push to end human trafficking, and he's leading a task force within the Georgia Attorney General's office. And then the following day, on October 21st, we have Ambassador Taranjit Singh Sandhu, the Ambassador of India to the United States. The topic, obviously, is U.S. and India strengthening the strategic partnership. Thank you very much, Susan Glasser. Thank you very much, Peter Baker. I want to thank our staff in the World Affairs Council, Fernando Lucchini, the Executive Director, and Valerie Lopez DeFranco, who, among other things, produces these shows. So thank you all. Thanks for spending time with us. And we're gonna invite you back in January or February to tell us what's happened and what's going on. Not if we're not with a book, but we want to know what's really going on in Washington, and if it's Trump 2 or Biden 1, how you see it and how things are going to play out. So thank you very much for spending this time with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you so much. Great discussion.
Cool. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Take care.